Welcome to the Public Square. We're still gearing up for the 250th birthday celebration of America. Today we're talking history, Thomas Paine, the consent of the governed, and where that concept can be found in the ancient biblical writings. I'm producer Alan C. Duncan in studio with Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Dr. Jeff Sanders, and Melanie Elsey. Dave, take it away.
It's always dangerous to start a broadcast or to include in a broadcast a line from a movie because so many movies have got things that are good and things that are not good. But there are some lines that just live outside the film. And one of those characters is Navin Johnson, one of the very first roles that Steve Martin ever played in film, in which he, at this stage in the life of the jerk, was a gas station attendant, and up rolls a truck. The truck opens up, and they hand Navin Johnson the phone book. And he goes nuts.
The new phone book's here! The new phone book's here! Well, I wish I could get that excited about that.
Well, that was exactly what happened to us today when one of our dear administrative staff people who had sent probably a half a dozen people on assignment around the world to get actual physical copies of the Atlantic November 2025 edition, The Atlantic, established in 1857. November 25, and this is the episode on the unfinished revolution. And we have it in our hands. The new Atlantics are in, the new Atlantics are in, there they are. And every single one of us has print copies in our hands.
It's very nice looking.
Oh yeah, they're very well designed. They have an entire fold out. How many panels is this fold out?
The opening cover is a fold out. It looks like Mad Magazine. It's like folds out 4 different folds out. Yeah. I keep wondering if I turn around the back and fold it upside down, will it actually tell me a different story? But it's remarkable.
Yeah, it's well designed.
So here we are. Why are we talking about the Atlantic and about this piece again? Well, Jeff, you and I were talking about this earlier, and you said, wait a minute, is this their 1619 project?
Yeah, seems to be that way.
It seems like when the New York Times decided they were going to rewrite American history and started in 1619, that they came out with all kinds of products and presentations and a narrative, and then it hit the rocks of historical review and then sunk. Because it just wasn't true. It was an interesting theory, and some of what was presented was honest and accurate, but it was insufficient. It was not a platform that would maintain the scrutiny of honest history. So now we have this piece in our hands, and this piece is designed by the Atlantic to capture the narrative of the celebration of the Declaration of Independence and turn it into something completely different. Oh, look, the Atlantic introducing free Atlantic access for U.S. public high schools.
How nice.
Look at that. That ad is somewhere stuck in between page 57 and 54. So it's pages 55. Page 55 is a full-page promotion. The Atlantic is willing to now give their magazine. By the way, they don't give their magazine to anybody. They're now giving the Atlantic to U.S. public high schools for the purpose that all the AP history teachers and all the history teachers, and this, of course, will trickle down to junior high school and into grade school civics, all right, to tell the narrative of their view of what actually happened. And, of course, their view is simple. All right, we're supposed to be celebrating the Declaration, but what they're celebrating is an unfinished revolution. Now, we did some research, and you've already heard our little Alan, is about a 45-second little spot that you were doing just really good.
It's about 15 seconds.
It's 15. It's a stinger. It's really quick.
If you count the words of the Declaration of Independence, every word on the page, the total count is 1,458 words. The word revolution never appears in the Declaration. For a free copy of the Declaration, please visit thepublicsquare.com.
We did the counts, and I told this to Michael Del Giorno on your morning show. He said, yeah, who's the we? All right, he said, what hour of the night were you up counting the words of the Declaration of Independence? Well, I don't trust myself to count that well. So I found the most reliable counting sources I could. There's 3 ways to count the words of the Declaration. You can count just the text. You can count the text and the signature. You can count every single word on every page.
I checked to make sure you're right as well.
Yeah, and then I had to be fact-checked. So this is every single word on the page, beginning in Congress, all right, at the very top of the page, the part nobody looks at, including all the signatures, every word. And if you count every word, I think it's 1,458, I think, is the number. And the point is, the word revolution does not appear one time. Now, if you were starting a revolution, why wouldn't you say so?
Yeah.
Let alone act so. And of course, we talked in our last broadcast about the failure of acting on a revolutionary spirit or a revolutionary strategy. It wasn't a revolution.
It was an idea. It was a concept. It was something that had never been done.
The founding fathers were very clear from the get-go that they were not trying to overthrow the British crown.
Right. Or the Parliament.
Or the Parliament. In fact, the founding fathers, time and time again, tried to make peace before July 4th, 1776. Saying,
and after there were negotiations.
And even afterwards, they were never, and they knew you couldn't overthrow the British government, and they weren't not even trying to do such a thing. They were trying to regain the rights that they naturally had as English subjects that the Crown and Parliament had illegally taken away. And they said, we want that back. And of course, the British Crown said nothing doing, and so they said, okay, fine, we'll go our separate ways.
So here we are, and this is where we're going to be spending some time, but it gets more interesting than this. We're just not going to perpetually repeat, though we do intend to read thoroughly and to consider every single word in this copy of The Atlantic, every single article, every single author, and we're thankful that we have that opportunity. Now, I will tell you, Alan, you're going to crack up. This is a total surprise, okay?
All right.
We talked recently about Fintan O'Toole, the Irish drama critic, the Irish author, the Irish historian. He wears many hats very, very well. He is a brilliant writer. All right, it's not personal. All right, he was given the opportunity to write the article on what the founders would say now, which to me was almost like saying E.T. is going to come to Earth and tell us what George Washington thought. It's just like as far as you could get from reality that you would have, and that he has no scholarship published on the subject. That doesn't mean he's not a scholar. I'm not criticizing the man.
Right.
It's just that it's like they could have picked somebody who was a citizen.
Yeah, I keep thinking, would they ask George Will or Thomas Sowell or someone else to write on Irish history?
Or Polish history.
Yeah.
Give a lecture on Polish history, right? The first part was disconnected and never dealt with. But I found something that I agree with. Yes.
I'm listening.
With Fintan O'Toole. And this is significant. This is a big deal.
Okay.
Fintan O'Toole is a beautiful pianist. He plays the piano beautifully. And I have on my tunes, in my many different variations for our production studios, multiple copies of an Irish ballad that became famous during the Civil War, Kathleen Morvernon. And he would probably pronounce it much better than me. And it's a story, it's a love song about lovers who are separated because of war. And it became very famous in the 1830s and then on into the Civil War. And he has recorded that song. It's beautiful. I had it in my production tunes, and I thought, gosh, that's beautiful. I looked, I went, that's him. So there is something we agree on.
And can we play a little piece of it, maybe?
Probably not, because we'll probably get nailed on copyright, because they're probably not too happy with us right now. So no, we're not going to play.
No, I can't play. Oh, okay.
No,
all right.
No. Now, we will be using that particular song in the upcoming episode of Christmas in America.
Really? He made Christmas in America?
Well, he didn't.
He didn't, okay.
Right, he didn't. But I found something, at least, it was a beautiful presentation. So this is, look, we're all humans. I talked to somebody today, and this is going to sound like I'm doing a passive-aggressive defense mechanism. So please forgive me. Let me get it all out. Talked to somebody today, said the problem we've got right now in our country is every conversation is I'm right, you're wrong. We can't have a conversation. And it doesn't matter whether you're coming from the left or from the right. Every presentation is my narrative is superior to yours.
It's rare in life that you see everyone in one place united on one thing and they don't disagree on something, right? They're willing to do something. I saw that over the weekend. I was at the University of Iowa, Kinnick Stadium, football game, Penn State and Iowa, Saturday night. And the University of Iowa started a tradition in 2017. There's a children's hospital with a wing of some young people going through some very, very serious stuff. And at the end of the first quarter of every home football game in Iowa since 2017, all 70,000 fans, the referees go to midfield, the players from each team step out onto the field, and everyone all at once turns and waves to those families, to those kids going through a lot.
Please turn and face the University of Iowa Step Family Children's Hospital and give the kids a big wave who are watching the game tonight.
And it's everyone for one cause. There's people wearing Penn State shirts, Iowa shirts, everything. The referees, both teams. Now, I said as a coach, you're working in this college football game. Penn State, who'd lost 3 in a row going into it, turmoil, everything. But guess what? All their players were off the sidelines on the field waving to these people. And I'm like, when people come together for a cause, even people that are opposite sides, it's a touching moment and something to see. And we all know how young people going through some very tough circumstances impact each and every one of us. And I thought, boy, it felt good on that Saturday night for that moment to see everyone come together for one thing. It touched a lot of hearts. I know it touched me because I'd seen it many times on television, but to see it in person was something else.
There are so many things in that illustration that we will be able to apply to what's going to happen here in the next few episodes of The Public Square. Thank you, Rob. I didn't even know such a thing existed. Melanie, did you know anything about this?
No,
Jeff?
I didn't until he was telling the story earlier.
And the guy I was with said, hey, I'm taking you to these specific seats until the first quarter's over. We're not going to the other seats because you have to experience it from this vantage point. And I did, and it was touching.
Wow. Common cause. So there, everyone was united, and it wasn't about who's right, who's wrong, who's on top, who's losing. It was something very, very different. The point of our conversations here is there was another point in time in American history. It was discussed as a time when all 13 clocks struck together, when 13 colonies came together in agreement on a worldview and a commitment to liberty, and it was called the Declaration of Independence.
Well, unfortunately, our clock is telling me it's time for a break, but we'll be back very soon, so please stay with us.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
Back around the public square table, and Jeff, you wanted to mention something about the Atlantic magazine we're currently all looking at.
Well, I do want to go on the record and tell everybody I do like the Atlantic. I don't agree with them probably, 75% of the time. I think they do.
Come on, be honest.
Okay,
about
90. No, about 90% of the time. They do get some things right on occasion, and this magazine is just beautifully well put together. But there's a nice article here on what it takes to be a Revolutionary War reenactor.
I thought you might like that one.
Yeah, I'm a Civil War reenactor, and we were always jealous of the Rev War guys because you have to have a lot more money to be a Rev War guy. Those uniforms are incredibly, especially if you're a British soldier, those bearskin tall hats that they wear. That is a king's ransom to pay for that stuff. And the flintlock musket was more expensive than the cap and ball musket, percussion cap that I use.
Well, I also expect that Ken Burns' piece on the actual physical fighting of the War for Independence is going to be most fascinating, and it is very significant. We're not suggesting for a moment that the actual war was inconclusive or something to be taken for granted. My goodness. It was. I mean, you've got the Declaration, but without the war, you got nothing. You got words on paper. So of course, what General Washington and those brave citizens did, we want to celebrate. We want to discuss. We want to always be in an affirmative position because that's true history and it's real. But the point that somehow it was a revolution, I'm telling you, I spent a lot of time around the writings of George Washington and around a person who I think has probably studied those writings more than any person in this country, William B. Allen. And I will tell you right now, the word revolution did not roll easily off of George Washington's tongue.
I think we might have everything Washington ever wrote in a full volume set above our heads right now.
Yeah. In our library.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be there.
Yeah, and again, Jeff talking about the article that deals with those folks and individuals, and I often think back the pace of life at that time in regards to travel of mail, in regards of travel of communication. We live in I'm not even sure I can wrap my head around it, just because everything I need right now is basically at my fingertips.
The fastest anything could travel was by horseback, and things had not improved in transportation since the days of Julius Caesar. Think about that.
And did I hear correctly, or am I remembering correctly? You're talking months to guarantee to get a letter from New England to Europe.
Oh yeah, about 2 months.
Yeah. And if you were the president speaking to the king or the prime minister of parliament, maybe 3 weeks.
Can you imagine? You write something, send it off, and then like 3 days later, something happens.
Well, tell me, listen, I've spent the last year reading the diaries of John Quincy Adams. Now, he started writing when he was a youngster, before he was a teen, and finished in the last week of his life. There's a lot of entries. There's over 221 entries on the question or the subject of Christmas alone. When you spend, now I'm understanding when we sat with David McCullough and we talked with him over numerous occasions, and I always remember the first time I shook his hand or the first time I shook William B. Allen's hand, I thought to myself, these are the hands that have spent so much time studying the founding, studying these people. It's almost like the DNA might somehow be on their fingertips. I mean, they are so enmeshed. And Rob, the thing that I've noticed is exactly the point that you made. When you study their diaries and you read their writings day after day after day, you find that you have to slow down because you realize they didn't have electricity. They had no screen technology. There were no digits. These people spent time studying nature to learn God. They studied botany to understand Genesis. They studied astronomy to understand reality and metaphysics. They wrote, and like John Quincy Adams sometimes would go to church 3 times a week, and he was a Protestant. Sometimes he'd go 3 times a day on Sunday and go to 3 different denominations. I mean, if you wanted to go where people were meeting to talk about God, you didn't just click online and watch a YouTube video. All right, you had to go somewhere and sit with, and then he would comment on the sermons in these diaries, quoting the scriptures and asking questions. I mean, this was a whole different understanding of our humanity. And then what really tears me up is I realized, prior to 1997, a lot of us kind of had a little bit of that going for us before the cell phone. And then before the smartphone. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were a lot more, I don't know, human? But
sociable.
Yeah, but anyhow, it is a very, very different world. But what's interesting about it is it makes it even more examinable. Because we can read what they said. We don't have to guess.
There are no, it's not lost anywhere. Those are all in the communications of writing. Right now, we could jump on a video call with someone from Europe, have the discussion. No one would know about it. And it may not be written down.
There may never even be a transcript.
Never.
No way. Everything they were doing is written down. Well, not everything,
the FBI and CIA might have records of it, of course, but other than that.
Yeah, they're listening in right now, I'm sure.
All right, so let's.
Well, if I may, that's also one of the dangers of AI, in my opinion, is the creation of videos that people will say did take place, but did not take place.
That's already
all right,
happening.
listen, that's going to come to this discussion over the next year. But let's get back to the Declaration of Independence, okay? Because the point that we want to get here, and I can already see we're 2 segments deep, and there's so much to talk about this thing. I mean, the new phone books are in the new phone. All right, we got to focus, all right? And in focusing, I want to focus on one concept that I find is probably the anchor to this conversation, or one of the anchors, and that is the term the consent of the governed. Now, that term is directly found in the Declaration of Independence, and it is, if you will, the methodology by which civil government is given credence and credibility by the founders, that the people have the ability to self-govern based upon the consent of the governed because God gave them the rights to do so, and that governments only have credibility and authority based upon the people giving those governments their consent. The consent of the governed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the question we want to focus on is, where did that concept come from? And where did the founders look to find the origin of that concept? Did they find it in Plato? Did they find it in Aristotle? Did they find it in Sophocles? Did they find it in ancient Egypt? Did they find it in the Babylonians? Where were they looking in ancient civilizations to find that? Now, fortunately, they told us. They wrote lots and lots and lots about where these ideas came from. And their primary, and you say, well, look at all the different philosophers. Were all the philosophers Christian? Were they off? Listen, the consent of the governed is kind of obvious in nature, right? It's pretty hard to rule over something that doesn't want to be ruled. Difficult, right?
Yes.
And then, therefore, we have the question of force and power. That's pretty much the definition of what civil government looked like in the pagan world from the beginning. He who has the gold rules.
And he who has the sword rules. Yeah. Or
power
more swords.
And might makes right.
And that's still the way a lot of people think today.
Right, which
all
was
over the world.
Which is the king is law.
Yep.
However, what happens when that's no longer true and the law is king? And that was the reality of the colonial experience. What happens if we moved from might making right and the king is law to law is king? And how would we get there? And what model would we look at? Newsflash. The model that they look at was the ancient Hebrew Republic. Thus, the title of today's broadcast, Listen to Moses.
Dave, as I'm listening to you describe this, people have to take caution if they are to get their own copy of this edition of The Atlantic. You will not find these concepts described in here. And
exactly.
what they need to do before even reading one single article that misconstrues our history is they actually need to go back and refresh. If they're very familiar with the words of the Declaration, they still need to go back and read it again and again, multiple times, before you even look at an article in this publication. This publication is 148 pages.
And a key book to look at would be the one that you have referenced several times, Dave, and that's The Hebrew Republic by
Professor Eric Nelson
of Harvard. Yeah,
Right.
he is a professor of history. He knows what he's talking about, and it's very well documented. Yeah, going to this Atlantic booklet for truth about the American Revolution would be like going to the New York Times for a Sunday school lesson. You're not going to find it.
Right,
go to the primary source documents, go to the Declaration of Independence, and where the word democracy is never used, go to the writings of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and you're not going to find a lot of the stuff.
Start with Sam Adams.
Yeah, start with Sam.
Mm-hmm.
Start with Roger Sherman. Start with Livingston.
Pastor Mayhew. You could go back and study. Well, you could go to the founders. Go to read what they had to say. Now, okay, are there summary books? Yeah, there are. There's some excellent summary books that are out there. We've got a whole list of them at aproundtable.org. We have an entire series called the American Mission series in which we lay out a lot of these issues. But this is a lifelong journey. So you could hear this broadcast should help people get started.
I remember when I first started at the Round Table over 20 years ago, Gary Amos, Defending the Declaration, was one of the first 3 books I was required to read in starting here.
And it's still a good one. Defending the Declaration is an outstanding book.
You know, it's not just what the article says, it's what they leave out, too.
Good point, Jeff. We're going into a break now, but we'll be back for more of The Public Square.
Let's see, there's our tithe, food and clothing budget, taxes, all the insurance, and the car payments. Where's the line in your budget that helps pay the bill for fixing what's wrong in America? Log on today at aproundtable.org and join the growing team that's giving every month to get America back on track. Make your monthly contribution to aproundtable.org. Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the public square.
You're listening to The Public Square. I'm Alan C. Duncan with Dave Zanotti, Rob Walgate, Dr. Jeff Sanders, and Melanie Elsey.
The consent of the governed, where is the best example? Where are the examples that the framers and the founders looked at? Well, a lot of people say, well, the consent of the governed, that's simple, it's democracy. Okay, we could have that conversation. Did the founders build America upon any model of democracy? Well, they certainly would have considered the ability of people to debate and to vote and to seek representation as a democratic principle. But were they ever looking to build a democracy? Read their own words. The answer is no. In fact, they considered democracy the worst form of government. What they were interested in was a constitutional government where everyone was equal under the law and where there was full representation. See, we misunderstand the War for Independence if we think this was about taxation. Taxation without representation. They were just mad because they were getting messed around with by Parliament and the taxes weren't fair. No, everybody was getting messed around with by Parliament and the taxes weren't fair. Their problem was they didn't have a seat at the table. They were not represented. They were not equal citizens. And that was where the argument began. But what's the remedy? The remedy is the consent of the governed. So philosophically and in regards to the human nature, it is not possible to rule but by force, but by power, but by wealth, unless you have the consent. Then what shall be the ruler? Who shall decide? Well, we decided it shall be the law that shall decide. And that in that construct, we shall have the right to assent to the laws that we choose. Where do you find that model in ancient history? A true model that was lived out for thousands of years? You find it in what Eric Nelson calls, professor from Harvard, the Hebrew Republic. And where does the Hebrew Republic begin? Listen to Moses. We go back to the book of Exodus. And what we find is that when the children of Israel come out of Egypt, out of the land of bondage, out of the land of slavery, God brings them to Sinai. And when he brings them to Sinai, his objective is to explain to them who he is, what he expects, and to present to them a methodology of law by which they can agree, consent, by which they can live together on this earth, both pleasing to him and effectively be able to love and care for each other. This is what God suggests you should do. Well, they were the 10 Commandments. Oh, yes, they were the 10 Commandments, but let's be crystal clear about this. They had the right to say no.
And in Exodus chapter 19, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai in verse 7, so Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And you can keep reading there in chapter 19. The people buy into the covenant
2 times
with God. Yeah.
Yes. And then this is the part that most of us don't think about.
So there was an election there, you might say.
Yeah. Oh, sure there was.
They had to buy into it.
And it was unanimous consent.
They made a choice.
And then here's what's really interesting about this. It's kind of like, okay, that was good, but God had another idea. He said, okay, Moses, I want you to get Aaron and his sons, Joshua, your assistant, and I want you to take the 70 elders of the families of Israel. Mm-hmm. And I want you all to come up the mountain with me. Did you know that there were probably, I don't know, Jeff, somewhere 75, 70, 80 people up that mountain? At least 75.
Yep, at least
people
75.
up that mountain. Now, the rest of the people were cordoned off. They put ropes in. Don't you even touch this mountain or you will surely die when God comes down. This is not, and God said, we don't want the people breaking out here thinking they're going to get a visual, a cheap thrill of a spiritual experience. No, you stay right back there. And of course, once it began to happen, people didn't want anything to do with that mountain. They were scared to pieces because God was there. There was a communion. There was a communication. Now, for those people that are blatant materialists who have absolutely nothing but hostility toward the concept of transcendence, this will drive you nuts. Because you don't want to hear about some scary God who comes down on a mountain in a cloud, because you don't want to be scared by anything. Okay? Because you don't want to have the fear of the Lord. I understand. Who wants the fear of God? The fear of God will mess you up. All right? Well, if you've got your own thing going, why bother with him? And what's crazy about that is he'll let you think that way your whole life, if that's what you want, because he operates on the consent of the individual, the consent of the government. God will not force you. People there could have walked away.
God won't force you, but it's also interesting when we talk about the fear of the Lord or God's wrath or even see the frustrations of Jesus in the New Testament. It is with those people who claim to be following God and the Lord. Those are the people that need to have that fear and understanding. If you're doing that work, there comes some responsibilities.
So Moses goes up and down this mountain half a dozen times. He's up, he's down, he's up, he's down, he's up, he's down. He's bringing somebody back, somebody down, somebody up, somebody down.
He was in really good shape, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was in great shape, Jeff. This guy was in super shape. And then eventually they bring these 70 elders up, and what happens? The 70 elders come up to discuss this covenantal relationship, the buy-in, the consent of the governed. And then it gets wilder. God appears on the mountain, and he lets them have just a little peek of what it looks beyond the natural. Mm-hmm. Now, he does not reveal his face to any man, never has, but he exposes just a bit of his glory to these 70 elders. And it's described as a scene you could hardly imagine. It's beyond, they look up and they're seeing through a transparent...
it's shattering.
Sapphire. And it's magical, it's amazing, it's something beyond what we can create. Yeah. Well, they got this supernatural look. They knew that God was meeting with them.
It's a frightening experience also. It's not something that you walk away from feeling all cozy about. When you're seeing the living God or some manifestation, you're broken. You realize you're dealing with someone far above and beyond your capabilities.
And so they have this opportunity, and they have a meeting, and you know what they do? They have a big holy roller meeting. They bring up the worship band, and they turn on the smoke machines. No, they sit down and they have a meal together. Now that's a big part of covenant understanding and confirmations in ancient Hebrew tradition. Not bad with Italians either, I might add, but they have a meal together. This is a God who they sit with, they commune with, they eat with, they discuss with, and they choose to agree with, the consent of the governed. The Mosaic Law is called the Ten Commandments. It's much bigger than that. But we must never forget that it was 10 commandments and all of that law that they consented to, including the infrastructure of how they would deal with one another, and the concept of representation, consultation, and the law was above any single person. No one was above the law.
You see this later in the life of Israel when they have kings, when finally God gives them what they want, and they have kings. None of the kings make up the law that's legitimate, and all of the kings are still subject to the law of Moses. Nobody is above God's law.
So God kept his part of the deal.
He
didn't change the law because they flipped out. There was 400 years from the time of Sinai to the time of Saul. For 400 years, they wrestled with this methodology. God didn't change his plans. These people decided they had a lot of better ideas. And the prosperity of entering the promised land, conquering the promised land, and getting what you actually were after, they became more and more corrupted by the communities around them that did not have a covenant relationship with the living Creator God. And then they got themselves into trouble and they chose a king. And that's where Thomas Paine enters this conversation in colonial America.
Thanks, Dave. And we will talk about Thomas Paine when we come back for more of The Public Square. Welcome back around the Public Square table. I know we're about to go to Thomas Paine, but I just wanted to ask a quick question before we get onto that. We talked about the 70 elders in the Hebrew Scriptures receiving this law from God, having this meeting, so to speak, with the Lord. You look at Luke 10 in the New Testament, and you see Christ himself has 70 disciples with him that he's about to send out. Do you think he was intentionally mirroring that elder meeting at the time?
I never saw that.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. That, I mean, it's not an accident. 70 and 70 again, and so here's Yahweh in the flesh. Here's Jesus, and he's sending 70 elders to the nation of Israel again to talk to them about this kingdom that is at hand.
If we get off too far on the amazing synchronization of numbers, like 40 days. Moses was up on the mountain 40 days, then he was up on the mountain 40 days again. Jesus was in the wilderness 40 days.
It's always a number of trial.
There are so many correlations that you couldn't orchestrate, you couldn't fabricate, you couldn't conspire to assemble. I never even thought about that, 70 and 70. Let's go to Thomas Paine. Okay. Now, Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, was the most read pamphlet in the period of the American War for Independence. It is I can't say it's a companion piece of the Declaration of Independence, but it is a great portal into the understanding of what people were talking about. Now, as with Sam Adams' committees of correspondence that went around all the country and countryside and different to colonies and talking about the issues, remember, the Declaration was a document that was created out of the strife that was primarily happening in Massachusetts and New York, where the British were most aggressively persecuting and prosecuting the colonists. Virginia had to come on board and see that. And eventually the sense of the injustice of it all came forward. But there were people who were ahead of the conversation. Now, Thomas Paine was one of those people who was spending a lot of time on this in regards to intellectual capital. And right in the middle of his conversation, in his brief, what they call a pamphlet, we today would call it a booklet, Thomas Paine has a chapter titled Of Monarchy and Hereditary Succession. The point of it is he points out exactly what we're talking about. Near 3,000 years passed away from the Mosaic account of the creation before the Jews, under a national delusion, requested a king. Till then, their form of government, except in extraordinary cases where the Almighty interposed, was a kind of republic, administered by a judge and the elders of the tribe. Kings they had none, and it was held sinful to acknowledge any being under that title, but the Lord of hosts. All right, Thomas Paine was out saying it's the Hebrew Republic, and people understood it in that context. Now, Jeff, you had a question earlier. Aren't we talking about a theocracy, or how did you say it?
Yeah, well, okay, I can hear somebody objecting and say, why are you going to the Old Testament for to justify a form of government like we have today, some representative government, when in the Old Testament it was a theocracy?
Yeah.
God ruled directly, and you guys believe in the divine right of kings and blah, blah, blah,
okay,
blah, blah.
First off, we don't believe in the divine right of kings. That's exactly what that chapter in Thomas Paine's book was all about.
That was created by King James I.
Got to be ended. This is absolute ridiculous. That is not even remotely close to what the Bible teaches.
Right.
Did God choose earthly kings for his people? No. He let his people choose earthly kings in 1 Samuel chapter 8.
And boy, did they mess up.
Because of the
Consent of the governed.
Because of their persistence. He said, you guys don't want this. And they, oh, yeah, we want this.
And he held all of them to the standard of the law of Moses. Nobody was above the law.
Which that is a scary thing about the consent of the governed, is you can consent to some things that are bad for you.
And Samuel warned them, if you accept this form of government, the king will make you his slaves. So I want to say, with the Bible is a no king's book.
Well, there's one king, but
yes, there's one king. And you know what that one king dictates? The consent of the governed.
Yep.
Because you see, he's not an elected king.
No.
He's the creator.
There's no opinion polls.
No, he doesn't need a job. He doesn't need our assent to elevate his ascendancy. Our consent to elevate his ascendancy.
But in today's context, when we're seeing all of these no kings rallies and, people who are declaring we don't want a king, they are almost self-blinded by the fact that we don't have a king. Our form of government would not even permit us to get to that level without the consent of the governed.
This is why we're having this conversation, because history teaches us reality. Now, the No Kings movement is a great public relations approach. They're doing a really good job on the PR, and they're really ramping up a lot of sentiment. But when we study what is America, where did it come from? Thomas Paine could give a good lecture at a No Kings rally and explain the fact that you all are missing something here. What you're resisting is a system of government that broke the hereditary monarchy forever. You have the right to decide the kind of government you're going to decide. Now let's go back to theocracy for one quick sentence. I think that theocracy is a word that is used a lot in theological seminaries, and I've been there and I understand that. But I honestly think that if you study history significantly and you study Exodus significantly and you study the law of Moses, I think it's a shortcut term. It really is a shortcut term. It's not accurate. It truly is not accurate. Of course God is king. Of course he is. That's not even a question. What he established with the people whom he reached out in covenant with and they agreed was a republic. He was the lawgiver. They had the choice to agree or not. So I think there's a significant conversation there that can continue to go on. But let's go back. So Thomas Paine, we could answer the question with Thomas Paine. He affirms not just the consent of the governed, but the mistake that Israel made by choosing a king.
Well, and just an application, as you were referencing today, I think when we look at Thomas Paine, the consistency would be he would want no kings, even if you're best friends with the king. We don't want a king. And that's where I think in some of the things that are happening today, we're like, wait a minute here. You guys, the folks that are protesting seem to be okay with dictator moments a few years ago when you were friends with the king or agreed with the policies that were coming down in the United States. So it's important that people remain consistent. We don't want a king, even if the king would do everything that I would be in agreement with.
And timing is everything in comedy and in history. So just a few years ago, new files have been released of the writings of King George III. Dr. William B. Allen, our resident scholar, our trustee, our dear friend, who's been on this program, is the most popular guest to ever appear. He's a regular on this program, all right, has read through many of those documents and is convinced from his readings of the actual pen of King George III that George III was, one, translating Montesquieu, in the process of translating Montesquieu into English. Dr. Allen is only 3 of 3 who've ever published an English translation. King George was actually in the process of doing it, George III. And he was moving toward a concept of representative government and changing the role of the monarchy in England. In other words, what was happening in America was not falling on deaf ears in England. They did get there, and that's where they are today. Sure, they still have a ceremonial king. That's their right to have a ceremonial king. But that king does not dictate reality in England. They are a constitutional form of a republic.
There's an article about King George in this Atlantic. What were your thoughts on that piece?
I'm saving it for Dr. Allen.
Okay.
That's off limits until Dr. Allen gets here.
I can do some shameless self-promotion and tell everybody that on YouTube, the Public Square has a presence there, and they can look at a little short that Allen and I did where I talk about King George III, how he wasn't the vile, tyrannical monster that a lot of people think he was. He had his issues.
And Americans had their own PR campaign.
Yeah, we had our own PR stuff going. But anyway, take a look at that.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. Please do subscribe to us at TPS In Studio on YouTube. You can watch videos and listen to the audio versions of the Public Square there as well, especially if your station has to leave us now. But for everyone else, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Public Square. And Rob, you mentioned something during the break that we wanted to make sure that you said on mic.
Well, during the break, I said, when you talk to people in Europe, they tell you that Americans are far more enthralled with the king today than the Brits
the royal
are.
family, yeah.
Yeah, from an entertainment perspective, when you think about, watching anything that has to do with it, royal weddings, anything.
The Queen.
Anything. There are
King Ralph, one of my favorite movies.
Reporters.
It's a great movie.
the reporters that go from the United States and cover it ad nauseum on network television and cable television.
So what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, there's an entire movement. And David Brooks, in this particular publication, calls for the need for movements. There's an entire movement that's trying to convince us that the existing president of the United States is functioning as a non-representative, out-of-control king. That's a fair question, and it's a fair debate.
Well, historically, when you think of kings and dictators, my question would be, in what other place have protests been allowed? Have people been allowed to bring effigies of the so-called king or dictator and, hang them, do all different things when they know there's no repercussions from the government for doing such thing?
These are the same people who had no problem whatsoever during the COVID pandemic of masking up and doing whatever their presidents and their governors told them to do, regardless of the outcomes of people against their consent who lost their businesses, their education, who lost their freedoms, their liberties, their religious freedom.
They didn't want people to be able to leave their own home if they didn't make a medical decision that they agreed with.
You couldn't go to church in some states. The FBI would take down the information of your license plate.
You couldn't go to funerals. You couldn't go to
all based
any
upon
family
the
gathering.
edicts of people in the administrative executive branches of state and federal government. These are the same people who supported a president who was functionally incapable of doing the job, if we're being honest. And then when that president was summarily moved by powerful forces inside the Democrat Party from the nomination, which he had secured by actual votes, and replaced with a person who had no votes and was then nominated to be president of the United States, raised not a single objection over the king or kings who made that decision for them. So I'm a little bit confused. And this is not a defense of Donald Trump, period. If Donald Trump is functioning in one way, shape, form out of the law, he should be legally stopped in those actions because he is not above the law. No one is. Oh, by the way, this is the same group of people that had no problem weaponizing every level of justice departments at state and federal level to try to make the case that Donald Trump had broken the law and prosecuted him relentlessly. It's to the point of conviction. These are the same people that impeached him through the law. They have no problem taking on the king if they think he's operating that way, and I have no problem with them pursuing the prosecution. My problem is, how many outcomes do they have to have? How many courts have to tell them that there's a difference between someone operating within the law that you don't agree with and someone being a king and breaking the Constitution?
We've talked on this program through the years, no matter who was serving in the highest office in the land, about concern we have with executive orders. and staying inside the framework of executive orders.
When Barack Obama was ramming Obamacare down the throats of the United States citizens, and we studied that law, and we knew what a disaster it was going to be, and he came, and the proposal was going to turn itself into its own form of dictatorship. We published a No King's Peace and stood on the street and protested it.
Yeah,
we were there.
When he was in Strongsville.
Right nearby. So when someone steps outside the law and makes themselves an authority of themselves, they step outside the consent of the governed. And when anyone steps outside the law and outside the consent of the governed, we certainly, as Americans, should protest.
And there were plenty of examples during COVID as well where people with R's next to their name did the same thing. And we were the first ones there to say, wait a minute here. Wait a minute.
But here's the big close. The so what? Where's Congress?
Yeah.
The people in this magazine talked about, the people pictured on the front cover, put together a Congress. We have a representative body built upon law that is there by the consent of our votes, that is to never let this kind of thing happen if it's truly happening. Where is the United States Congress operating on behalf of the Constitution and the rule of law?
And there were a lot of people through the years that looked at us maybe with a touch of side eye when we would talk about the filibuster, cloture, the rule of 60. Mm-hmm. And we would say, hey, if you have the House, you have the Senate, and you have the White House, you should be able to get done what you want to get done. And I think in today's –
except for the kings of the Senate –
yes,
who dictate through the filibuster what they will want, and it's all backroom side deals, period. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, or Martian.
And the most perfect example is the government shutdowns.
Yeah.
When they happen over time, those shutdowns are not because they can't get a majority vote on the budget. They can't get past the filibuster. They can't get the 60 votes for cloture to get to a vote. So that doesn't even make sense.
What is wrong with those people? You can't run a government that way. Look, they exempt different portions where you don't have to do the filibuster because they don't want the political hassle. But when it comes to the budget, you can't go on simple majority.
Yeah.
You can't agree and say, look, we got to pay our bills.
There's democracy
and they did it years
in action
ago, right,
there
with the judicial confirmation process.
Right.
Went to a simple majority, and why not go to a simple majority on everything?
The kings are sitting on top. The kings are sitting on top of the United States Senate. And they're Republicans and Democrats, but that's too much work. It's easier just to point at one name and vilify one person and win one office. Well, if you win that one office, then what are you going to do? Put a king in? Or wait a minute, didn't we just talk about that? Wasn't that COVID? Okay.
There's another element in this, though, that we can't miss in terms of the consent of the governed. We've talked about, the role of the legislature, and that's very important. But we also have the role of the governed, the people who are to be consenting. You can't consent if you don't participate. So when you have an election, for example, mayoral election in New York City, if 15, 20% of the people show up to elect somebody, that's not really the consent of the governed. Non-participation is a killjoy on the concept of consent.
Non-participation is surrender to slavery.
Right.
Because now someone else is making all the decisions for you. The point is this, and I'll tell you right now where we're going to end up a year from now, is simply this. If we rediscover the founding principles of self-government and personal responsibility under the rule of law, we could make the federal government largely irrelevant and still have all the things that work best. We could still have nice things. And we could do it better than it's done in Washington. The problem isn't arguing about who's playing the role of king. The problem is looking in the mirror and saying, what are we doing back home to make the government irrelevant in regards to loving our neighbor? Listen, I'm all for protests, I'm all for rallies, but enough's enough. Let's drop the rallies. I don't care who the rally's for. And rallies is for one side of the conversation. Let's drop the protests. Let's go home and run for school board. Let's go home and run for city council. Let's go home and love our neighbor.
Well, and we're used to phone books coming once a year, but for the next 12 months, they're going to show up every month, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about the Atlantic and what they're talking about when it comes to the 250th.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But you can always find us at thepublicsquare.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeart, or YouTube. Thanks, Dave, Rob, Jeff, and Melanie for the conversation today, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next time around the table at the Public Square.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.